The summer morning was calm, the sun rising over the lake, casting golden reflections on the water. I stepped out onto my property, the fresh scent of grass and water filling the air. My fence stood tall and sturdy, stretching along the edge of the lake, marking the boundary I had carefully maintained for years. That was when I saw her, Karen from the HOA, marching toward me, clipboard in hand, her expression sharp and disapproving. "Good morning," I said cautiously, hoping to avoid confrontation. Karen did not smile. She pointed at the fence and immediately launched into a tirade. "This fence has to go," she said firmly. "It violates HOA rules, and you have no right to keep it there." I tried to explain politely that the fence had been inspected and approved years ago and that it did not infringe on any property lines. But Karen would not listen, her voice rising each second, the neighbors peeking from their windows as her words grew louder. She threatened to call the police if I did not remove the fence immediately, her tone leaving no room for discussion. I remained calm, refusing to argue aggressively, knowing that the property documents were on my side. Within minutes, her phone was out, and she was calling the authorities, insisting that I was violating HOA regulations. When the officers arrived, I explained the situation, clearly showing them the approved permits and boundary lines. Karen insisted I was wrong, that the fence was illegal, but the officers listened and took notes quietly. After a long discussion, they left with polite instructions that no one should take matters into their own hands. Karen, however, was furious. She stomped back to her car, muttering threats about fines and lawsuits. Weeks passed, and her threats escalated, but I kept all documentation, records, and photos proving that the fence had been legally erected. One morning, a certified letter arrived. It was from a lawyer representing me, stating that any attempt to enter my property without permission would be considered trespassing. Karen, true to form, could not resist, and one afternoon, she tried to cross onto my property, ignoring the warning signs and shouting complaints. I calmly documented everything, taking photos and videos as she stepped onto the land. The moment was tense, but I knew I had all the evidence I needed. The case quickly escalated to court, where her trespassing and aggressive behavior were laid bare for everyone to see. The judge reviewed the evidence, my property papers, the photos and videos, and listened to witnesses from the neighborhood. Karen's face grew red as her arguments fell flat one after another. When the ruling came, it was clear my fence was perfectly legal and Karen had committed trespass by entering my property without consent. The courtroom erupted in murmurs as the judge ordered a fine against her and mandated she stay off my property. Walking out of the courthouse, I felt a mix of relief and vindication, knowing that standing my ground had paid off. Karen stormed out of the courthouse, her face twisted in anger, her hands shaking as she muttered under her breath. The neighbors who had gathered outside whispered among themselves, some laughing quietly, others shaking their heads in disbelief. I walked back to my car, feeling a strange mix of satisfaction and exhaustion, the tension of the past weeks finally lifting. As I drove home, I thought about how quickly the situation had escalated from a simple disagreement about a fence to a full-blown court case. When I arrived at my property, I saw my fence standing tall and proud, catching the sunlight just like it had every morning. I stepped onto the grass, taking a deep breath, the familiar scent of lake water and freshly cut grass calming my nerves. Later that evening, I noticed Karen lurking near the edge of the neighborhood, her eyes narrowed as she watched from a distance. I ignored her presence, knowing that the court had ruled firmly in my favor and that she had no legal right to approach my property again. Over the next few days, Karen sent multiple letters through the HOA claiming the fence still violated regulations. I forwarded each one to my attorney, carefully documenting every detail, knowing that any further trespassing attempts would only strengthen my case. The HOA tried to mediate, but after reviewing the court ruling, they backed off, leaving Karen frustrated and isolated. Word of the case spread through the neighborhood, neighbors approaching me to share their support and admiration for standing up to her. It became clear that my patience and careful documentation had turned the situation around completely. Even as Karen fumed in her own home, I felt a sense of peace, knowing that my property was protected and my rights upheld. The lake shimmered in the afternoon sun, and the fence stood firm, a symbol not just of boundary, but of persistence and standing your ground. I walked along the edge of my property, feeling the warm breeze and watching the water ripple calmly, knowing that the battle was over, but the lesson had been unforgettable. Days turned into weeks, and the neighborhood slowly returned to its normal rhythm. Karen avoided my property completely, though I could see her glaring from a distance whenever she thought no one was watching. The HOA held meetings, but no one dared to challenge my fence after seeing how firmly the court had sided with me. Neighbors began to wave and stop by more often, bringing small gifts, or just to chat, knowing that I had faced the toughest scrutiny and won. I spent my mornings walking along the lakeside fence, enjoying the quiet and the peaceful view of the water. Sometimes I would notice ducks gliding across the surface or the reflection of the trees shimmering in the sunlight. The feeling of security and control over my own property was something I had not appreciated fully until now. Karen, meanwhile, grew more isolated as her credibility with the HOA dwindled, her constant complaints ignored by everyone who had witnessed the court case. I received messages from neighbors sharing that she had even tried to complain about trivial things at other homes, but no one took her seriously. The fence, once a point of contention, became a symbol for the neighborhood, a reminder that rules must be followed and that trespassing had consequences. One afternoon, as I sat near the lake sipping iced tea, I noticed a few children playing safely along the edge of the property. Their laughter was light and carefree, a stark contrast to the tension that had filled the yard weeks before. I smiled, knowing that standing firm had not only protected my property, but also created a space where others could feel safe. The sun began to set, casting a warm orange glow across the lake, and the fence glinted softly in the fading light. Karen remained in her house unseen by most, and slowly the story of her failed attempts became part of neighborhood lore. I leaned back in my chair, feeling a deep sense of satisfaction, knowing that patience and documentation had turned a threatening situation into a victory that would last for years. Weeks passed, and the neighborhood began to settle into a new routine. Karen no longer made appearances near my property, and her previous influence with the HOA seemed to vanish completely. I spent more time enjoying the lake, watching the light dance across the water, and listening to the gentle rustle of the trees. Neighbors often stopped by for a chat or to admire the fence, now standing as a symbol of perseverance. Even the children who once played cautiously now ran freely along the edge of the property, laughing and shouting with joy. One morning I noticed a couple of neighbors approaching me with smiles and coffee in hand. They thanked me for standing my ground and protecting the peaceful view of the lake for everyone in the neighborhood. It felt good to be recognized, not for confrontation, but for calmly defending what was right. Karen's occasional attempts to contact the HOA continued, but they were ignored or politely dismissed by the board. The once tense and hostile atmosphere around my property had completely transformed into one of respect and community. I found myself spending hours just sitting by the fence, enjoying the scenery and the feeling of being in control of my own space. Even the wildlife around the lake seemed to sense the peace now lingering along the shore. Her failed attempts had inadvertently strengthened the bonds among neighbors who now openly supported one another. I realized that the court ruling and her trespassing incident had done more than protect a fence. It had reinforced the importance of boundaries and respect. As the sun set each evening, painting the lake in shades of gold and pink, I felt a sense of calm and accomplishment, knowing that the struggle had ended in the most satisfying way. The following weeks passed with an unusual calmness in the neighborhood. Karen stayed mostly inside her home, avoiding any contact or confrontation. I spent mornings walking along the lakeside fence, greeting neighbors who waved warmly as they passed. The HOA meetings became routine and uneventful, with no one daring to challenge the legality of my fence. Children played freely along the edge of my property, their laughter carrying across the water as if celebrating the peace that had returned. Neighbors would occasionally stop by with stories of their own minor disputes and how they had resolved them, inspired by how the fence situation had ended. I began planting flowers along the fence line, adding color and life to the property that had been the center of so much tension. The lake reflected the changing seasons, painting the scene with golden leaves in autumn and sparkling ice in winter. Karen's attempts to communicate through letters or phone calls dwindled and eventually stopped completely. The fence, once a source of conflict, had become a symbol of persistence and quiet strength in the neighborhood. Every time I walked along the lakeside, I felt a sense of accomplishment, knowing that I had stood firm, yet handled the situation with patience and dignity. Even wildlife returned to the area, with birds nesting near the fence and fish swimming close to the shore, as if sensing the calm that had settled. One afternoon, a neighbor approached and said the story of my confrontation with Karen had become a lesson in the neighborhood for standing up for what is right. I smiled quietly, knowing that the struggle had done more than protect a fence. It had strengthened the community and reinforced the value of boundaries and respect. As the sun set over the lake each evening, I felt a deep sense of peace, knowing that the property I had fought to protect was now a place of harmony and safety. Months passed, and the lakefront property became a place of quiet enjoyment. Neighbors stopped by more frequently, bringing stories and treats, and sometimes just sharing a few peaceful moments by the water. The fence, once a source of conflict, now stood as a reminder of patience and perseverance. Karen had not attempted to approach the property again. Her influence in the HOA all but vanished. I spent early mornings walking along the water, watching the sunrise, painting the lake in shades of pink and gold. Birds chirped in the trees, and the gentle lapping of the water against the shore created a serene soundtrack to the mornings. Sometimes I would see children running along the fence line, their laughter echoing across the neighborhood. The HOA meetings continued, but discussions about boundaries and property lines became polite and structured without the tension that had once filled the room. Neighbors who had been quiet before now shared their support and admiration openly for standing firm against Karen's unreasonable demands. I planted more flowers along the fence line, adding bursts of color and life to the area that had been the center of so much drama. Even wildlife seemed more present, squirrels and ducks appearing regularly, as if recognizing the safety and calm now established. The story of Karen's trespassing and the court ruling became a cautionary tale shared quietly among residents, teaching the importance of respect and proper boundaries. I often sat by the fence in the evenings, sipping tea, watching the water ripple under the soft glow of the setting sun. It was in these quiet moments that I truly appreciated the peace that had been restored and the way a simple act of standing firm had created lasting change. Every day the fence reminded me not just of the struggle but of the patience, documentation, and courage it took to protect what was rightfully mine. Seasons changed, and the lake reflected each shift with quiet beauty. Spring brought fresh blooms along the fence line, their colors bright and welcoming. I spent afternoons tending to the garden and enjoying the calm sounds of the neighborhood. Neighbors began stopping by more frequently, sharing stories and laughter, and sometimes helping with small tasks around the property. Karen was rarely seen outside her home, her attempts to influence the HOA forgotten by most. The fence had become more than a boundary, it was a symbol of resilience and standing firm. I often walked along the edge of the lake, feeling the soft breeze against my face and listening to the gentle ripple of water. Children played freely along the property lines, their laughter carrying across the yard as if celebrating the peace. The HOA meetings continued, but discussions about rules became calm and structured with little fear of conflict. Neighbors shared their respect openly, telling me how they admired my patience and composure through the whole ordeal. Even the wildlife seemed to flourish around the lake, birds nesting in the trees and ducks swimming close to the shore. I planted more flowers and shrubs, creating a peaceful oasis that reflected the serenity I had fought to protect. The story of the fence and Karen's trespassing became a quiet legend in the neighborhood, a reminder of the importance of standing up for what is right. I often sat on a bench near the lake at sunset, watching the sky turn shades of orange and pink and thinking about how much had changed. Each evening brought a sense of calm and accomplishment, knowing that the property I had defended was now a place of harmony, safety, and beauty. One crisp morning, I walked along the lakeside path, noticing how peaceful everything had become. The water shimmered under the early sunlight, and the flowers along the fence swayed gently in the breeze. Neighbors waved from their yards, some stopping briefly to chat about the calm that had settled over the neighborhood. Children ran along the property, laughing and playing, as if the tension that had once filled the air had never existed. Karen's house sat quietly at the far end of the street, her presence barely noticed by anyone anymore. I paused near the fence, running my fingers along the smooth wooden posts, feeling the history of the months of struggle etched into each one. The court ruling and her trespassing incident had become a turning point not just for me, but for the entire community. The HOA meetings were now calm and respectful, with discussions focused on improvement rather than confrontation. Even wildlife returned in abundance, birds chirping, squirrels running along the shore, and fish visible beneath the clear water. Neighbors shared stories of how the events had inspired them to stand firm in their own disputes and respect the boundaries of others. I spent long afternoons tending the garden, planting new flowers and adding small decorations to make the property more inviting. Sitting on the bench by the lake, I often reflected on how patience, documentation, and composure had turned a difficult situation into a lasting victory. Each sunset painted the lake in golden and pink hues, and I felt a deep sense of satisfaction, knowing the peace I had fought for was now permanent. The fence stood as a quiet testament to perseverance, a symbol of boundaries respected and lessons learned by everyone in the neighborhood. Weeks turned into months, and the neighborhood settled into a routine of calm and harmony. I spent mornings walking along the lakeside fence, greeting neighbors who smiled and waved as they passed. The fence remained a symbol of the perseverance and patience it had taken to protect my property. Children played safely along the edge of the yard, their laughter carrying across the lake like a gentle celebration. Karen stayed inside her house, avoiding any interaction, her influence with the HOA all but gone. The HOA meetings became simple and orderly, with no one daring to challenge my fence or dispute its legality. Neighbors often stopped by to share small gifts or just to chat, knowing the story of the fence had inspired many. I continued planting flowers and shrubs along the fence line, adding bursts of color and life to the property. Birds nested in the trees and ducks returned to the shoreline, as if sensing the calm and respect that now filled the area. The story of the fence and Karen's trespassing became a quiet legend among the neighborhood, a reminder of boundaries, respect, and standing firm. I often sat on the bench by the lake, sipping tea, watching the ripples in the water reflecting the changing light of the sun. The property felt safe and serene each day, a reminder that patience, courage, and proper documentation could protect what was rightfully mine. And as the seasons passed, the fence remained standing tall, a testament to the peaceful victory and the harmony it had helped create. As the sun dipped below the horizon one evening, the lake glowed with golden light, and a gentle breeze rippled across the water. I sat on the bench by the fence, feeling the calm that had finally settled over my property and the neighborhood. The children's laughter had faded into the quiet hum of evening, and the birds had returned to their nests. Neighbors waved from their yards, some stopping briefly to share a smile or a few kind words. Karen's house remained quiet at the far end of the street, her attempts to interfere now long forgotten. The fence stood tall and strong, reflecting the sunlight, a symbol of patience, perseverance, and respect for boundaries. I took a deep breath, feeling a sense of accomplishment and peace, knowing that the struggle had not only protected my property, but had strengthened the community around me. The lake mirrored the fading colors of the sky, and I knew that the victory was permanent, the lessons clear, and the calm unshakable. With one last glance at the fence and the shimmering water beyond, I rose from the bench, ready to enjoy the serenity that had been hard-won. The neighborhood had learned the value of respect, the power of standing firm, and the quiet strength that comes from patience and determination.